Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea Harding, and I am the Community Relations and Events Manager here at CG. I'd like to welcome you to our event this evening, Ending the Cycle, Leveraging Tech, Data, and Governance to Combat Human Trafficking, presented in partnership with Communitech as part of their Data Hub sessions. Thank you all for joining us this evening for what I think is going to be a very eye-opening and informative discussion. And again, thank you so much to Communitech. This started as a conversation between Chris and myself over the summer and turned into a lot of back and forth of what we should do before this event came to be, and we're really happy to be able to partner with you to make this happen. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. CG is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the 6 nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. This land does not belong to those of us who are settlers here, and it is important that we respect it and reduce our impact on it. So tonight, on to what's happening tonight. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Una Fitzgerald, Director of International Law here at CG, to moderate our discussion. Una established and oversees CG's international law research agenda and has extensive experience in providing strategic leadership in international law, national security, public law, human rights, and governance. Prior to joining CG, Una was a senior executive in the federal government providing legal policy, advisory, and litigation services. For those of you who've joined us before, you've probably seen Una on stage with us as she's filled the role of moderator for us a number of times here. She will be joined on stage today by Matt DeMart, a member of the Waterloo Region Police Services since 2004 and an investigator in the Special Victims Unit working in human trafficking for the past 3 years. In those 3 years, there have been many investigations that have led to lessons learned pertaining to victim management and in the ups and downs of the court process from both victims and police. He believes the involvement of the many valuable community resources and partners is something that needs to be praised, and evenings such as this raise awareness, which can only help with the cause. Neil Desai is also joining us. He's Vice President at Magnet Forensics, who leads strategic engagement with leaders from policing, national security, and government agencies to support their transformations in the realm of cyber investigations and digital evidence. He previously served with the Government of Canada in senior roles and is a fellow with the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and a faculty member of Singularity University. He's also lent his expertise to CG a number of times, and some of you may recognize him. He's been on the stage here before. Thank you for coming back again. Nikki Carswell is also joining us. She's from the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region and joined there in 2018 to lead their anti-human trafficking program. She has provided some much-needed insight on a local level, including the recent news that you might have seen about the anti-human trafficking curriculum that will be used in Waterloo Region District School Boards for grades 7th and 8th students. She'll be bringing a social services and community voice to the stage here tonight, and we really thank her for joining us as well. And finally, Mike McIntosh. He's a Senior Manager, Monitoring and Analysis in Global Anti-Money Laundering at TD Bank Group. They all have very, very long titles of what they do. Mike has been working in anti-money laundering and Canadian banking for the last 5 years. In this capacity, he has had oversight of regulatory technology projects, transaction monitoring, and business intelligence. He has been involved with several focused working groups related to human trafficking, as well as projects dealing with the money laundering aspects of drug trafficking and money movement to and from high-risk jurisdictions. We all had dinner earlier together tonight, and I can tell you the conversation at dinner, if it's even half as stimulating as what you're going to hear tonight, like it is, this conversation, I'm really happy you could all join us on stage. You're bringing a lot of different backgrounds, which I think is going to give us a really well-rounded topic, so we're really looking forward to it. The format will be, there's no actual formal presentation. It's going to be they'll all join on stage. They'll have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll open it to audience questions. Put your hands up if you have a question to ask, and we have some volunteers here at the front with our catch boxes that'll come around with the mics. They'll kind of toss it to you or pass it to you. They're soft, so if it kind of gets thrown at you, don't worry, it's not going to hurt. The topic, or the discussion tonight involves a very sensitive topic, and we understand people might be triggered by the content. So if you do need to talk either during the event or after the event, we have 2 volunteers from the Sexual Assault Support Center. Tanya and Sarah, could you raise your hands, stand up for us up here at the front? So if you do need to talk afterwards or during, if it's during, just tap them on the shoulder. If you walk out, they might just follow you to make sure you're okay, and you can chat with them afterwards if you need to. Hopefully you also had a chance to stop by the booths in the foyer before the event. So Sleep Tight, Family and Children's Services, the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region, and Crime Prevention Council are all here to talk about kind of what they're doing in the community, the services they have to offer. So if you didn't get a chance, they'll also be out there afterwards, as well as maybe some cookies and coffee if there's any left over, so you can chat with them. And thank you as well for all of you for being here tonight to share and be able to share and be a part of this evening. So this is our last CG event of 2019 during the evening, but we do have a lunchtime event on December 4th on data and social media platform governance. We seem to be doing a lot of scary work here now about like platform governance and social media and how that affects. So if you're around at lunchtime on December 4th, we invite you to join us for a lunch and as well as a talk from our director for global economy, who's doing a lot of work on that here. We also now have a big tech podcast. You might have seen the slide up here earlier by Taylor Owen, who is one of our fellows here, that's starting to air, again, kind of interesting / scary stuff. I highly encourage you to check it out. So if you're looking for more information, check out cgonline.org/events. Check it out in the new year when we have more events posted for after the holidays. So before I begin, I'm just going to turn it over to Chris Wilshire, his Director of Data Platforms at Communitech, to share a few remarks.
Thanks, Andrea. So to be very brief, I just wanted to, on behalf of Communitech, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is actually part of our Data Hub session series that we often run. Typically, they're a lunchtime session that we run at the Data Hub just down the street. And really what we're trying to do with that is bring the ecosystem together to talk about data and events technology and a lot of the challenges and opportunities that face in terms of trying to leverage that. But oftentimes it's really with a commercial purpose in mind and an end goal. But that being said, data and advanced technology are assets that can essentially be used for helping to fight against a lot of these social issues that we're seeing. And it requires a lot of collaboration between multiple stakeholders from the private sector, the public sector, social services, to come together, really start to understand the problem and begin to formulate solutions of how data and technology can be leveraged in ways that can help enable those that are on the front lines fighting for a lot of these social causes. Help them do their job better day in and day out. So I'm really thrilled that we were able to get a panel of diverse perspectives to come up here on the stage tonight. As Andrea had alluded to, the conversation at dinner was really, really enthralling and engaging. And I think it'll be a really great event. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Una and the panelists to come on up on stage and get the conversation started.
So thank you very much, Andrea and Chris, for that great welcome. And thank you to all this wonderful audience for coming today. This is going to be a very interesting discussion. We have a really important and complicated story to tell you tonight about the connections between new technologies and one of the most egregious crimes imaginable that happens in our very midst, human trafficking. The enslavement of young people, usually young girls, for sexual exploitation, profiteering, physical abuse by the traffickers and their customers. So who better to tell this story than these four amazing individuals who Andrea has already introduced to you? They, every day, use their unique skills to work to end human trafficking or to provide support to those caught in it, to extract them from its web, to identify, investigate, disrupt, and bring to justice the traffickers. Today, this evening, we're going to learn about what is human trafficking in Ontario and Canada, and sort of in the world, how we fit, how internet communications enable the perpetrators of human trafficking, and also contribute to entrapping the victims. We'll learn about how technology can be used to prevent human trafficking and what the policy ramifications are of this sort of technology battle, on both sides of human trafficking. So, how to tell such an important and complicated story? We discussed it a few weeks ago, and we thought the best way to do it was probably through a series of questions and a conversation among these individuals. And you will then have a chance to pose some questions as well. And I think that's basically how we're going to go. So since you've already been introduced to the speakers, we'll start off with a first question. And it really is just so that people in the audience understand what this topic is that we're talking about. So can you help us understand what is the situation of human trafficking in our very community? What is it? What is it not? And what is the scope of the problem in the region, nationally and internationally? And I think it'd be really nice to hear maybe from Nikki first. Are you comfortable to go? Give us some background. And Matt, I think, are the two of you. So one of you like to start?
You want me to start?
Yep.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess, first of all, what we have to understand is what human trafficking is, and it's the deliberate exploitation of people for profit, and it's greed, it's selfishness, and it can be either through forced labor or forced sexual work, things of that nature. And I know Nikki can kind of get into a little bit more of that side of it. But what it isn't, it's not a caring relationship, as much as it would appear to be to some of these survivors, some of these victims. It's definitely not a caring relationship. And it's not a situation where your trafficker has done something nice to you, so now you have to do something nice for them. And that's kind of how they're made to feel. And that's some of the recurring themes that we've been seeing in my time here.
Yeah, and to put it simply, it's really just forcing someone to provide sexual services against their will, whether it be through psychological manipulation, having a relationship with someone and using that relationship, the love and trust gained in that relationship to exploit them, whether you're threatening them, threatening their friends, family, loved ones, themselves, blackmailing them, so maybe they've taken, pictures of them naked or pictures of them doing sexual acts and are now threatening to expose that, whether across schools, within families, amongst communities. There's using fear, sometimes force. It's very psychologically manipulative. A lot of clients and a lot of survivors in our region don't even understand that they're being trafficked. They meet someone, whether it's a friend or a boyfriend, who gets to know them, gets to know who they are, who are their supports, what's their routine like, what are their vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are things like family breakdown, needing to be involved with child welfare, having mental health concerns, not having a lot of money, not having a lot of friends, maybe being homeless. And those things aren't our fault, but there are people in our community who take advantage of those things, become close with us, and then use those things against us to get us to do things that we're not proud of, can't get out of, or don't even understand is happening. Another common part of it is petty crimes. A lot of the time, traffickers will get people to commit crimes like theft, harassment, I don't know all the clinical...
And drug trade as well.
Selling drugs. Doing things that are against the law, so then they later can say, hey, you actually can't report me because you did this and this and this. It's really complex, it's really complicated, it's not black or white, it's very gray, but it is happening here. Ontario represents close to 70% of Canada's sex trafficking cases. 93% of that is happening to our young women and girls, so this is a gendered issue.
And they're also, when we talk about what human trafficking is, we always feel the need to differentiate between what human trafficking is and what human smuggling is, where human smuggling would be the movement of bodies over international borders for monetary gain. Human trafficking is exploitation-based, so we can definitely see, and it's not like, it's not like Taken with Mr. Neeson there, but what we have is you can definitely see where they would become indebted to their smugglers. So suddenly the situation's changed. These people are brought to a different country for a monetary fee, and then all of a sudden that fee wasn't enough. So now you have to work it off by doing something for me. So while there is a difference, and there's a big difference, human smuggling is actually dealt with by the RCMP and Canada Border Services. It's not dealt with by like local municipal police services. It can definitely fall from it. There's definitely an indebtedness that can fall from that.
And there's a big difference between international and domestic trafficking as well. A lot of folks in our community still believe that this is primarily happening on an international level, that people are being brought in from other countries for the purpose of sexual exploitation, when in fact what we're most commonly seeing is domestic. So young women and girls, boys, transgender folk, non-binary people being trafficked right here in our communities without ever crossing a border, sometimes never even leaving the community. It is popular to be trafficked up and down the 401 and the QEWs because they're large, expansive highways that connect a lot of rural communities with urban communities and urban with other urban. Lots of different jurisdictions, easy to move along, lots of hotels and motels, easy to happen. But people can be trafficked right out of their own homes and right in their own community without ever leaving. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand.
And that movement can be from one end of Cambridge to the other. It can be from one end of the region to the other. It can be from region to region. It doesn't matter. It's still human trafficking.
We are going to share a quick story so that people get a glimpse of what it looks like. And we're going to talk about a client named Bella. So, and I've changed all the details, so this person is safe. But let's say our program received a call from FNCS regarding a 15-year-old girl named Bella. She was displaying several signs of trafficking, such as constantly being on her phone or the internet, going missing for long periods of time, particularly at night, being picked up from her home in fancy cars, coming home with new clothing or a cell phone and was really secretive about it. So we went out and we met Bella within 24 hours and we started to form a relationship. We'd meet with her in her home, we'd meet with her at McDonald's, Tim Hortons, we'd take her to the park, we'd drive with her in our cars to the mall, whatever works for her, whatever makes her feel comfortable. And we started building relationships with the folks of places where she frequents, like the library or her school. But then Bella went missing, and she went missing for several days. And when she returned, she was able to share enough detail with us that it was apparent she was involved in trafficking. Bella started to change after this experience. She stopped going to school, she stopped taking care of her physical and mental health, she disconnected from her friends and family, and she started using substances. Her behavior became violent and unmanageable, and her family moved her into a temporary group home. We talked with her about all her different options, such as going to hospital, meeting with police, meeting with victim services. She did agree to meet with police, Matt, who did come to our office, dressed down, casual, made it a very simple meet and greet, totally made her feel comfortable, very relaxed attitude. And Bella did report enjoying meeting him, but she did not report her trafficker. And a lot of trafficking that goes on in our community is unreported. And that's because they're scared. They fear their trafficker. They fear repercussions. They've seen violence. They've been threatened. Or they don't know they're being trafficked because they've been so psychologically manipulated. And often, snitches get stitches, as I'm often told. So that's a thing.
It is. Yeah, and I can say that since joining the human trafficking unit in 2017, and we're a fairly large, prosperous region. Our human trafficking unit until 2017 was one person. We expanded in 2017 to two. So they added me. And I mean, we've been involved in upwards of 160 investigations since 2017. We've laid probably close to that number of charges since 2017. It's been busy. And I mean, our victims range, like Nikki said, like we've had victims as young as 14, we've had a victim as old as 47. There's no rhyme or reason. It can literally be anyone. If the traffickers find the crack, they find their way in, they'll exploit it, they'll manipulate it, and they will try their best to make this happen because of their greed, because of their exploitation, because of their want for money. So that's kind of our local. When you said on the national stage, the numbers aren't the greatest out there to find right now, but the one that I did find was from July of this year. There were 2016 stats. 1 out of every 100,000 police reported incidents in Canada was for human trafficking. So it's growing, and I would say 100%, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We don't see anywhere near the instances of where it's actually happening, and the barriers are built up. The police, as the police, we don't see them. The victims are afraid, the survivors are afraid, and they're manipulated into being afraid. So we've already got barriers when they come into any kind of situation, and even the suggestion of coming to talk to the police is scary for them. When Nikki said that I showed up in my dress down, that's my everyday. This is very uncomfortable for me. But we find that is what works. The suit and tie, the uniform, it can be very intimidating for people, and especially people that are dealing with trauma. So that's kind of the approach that we take, and we're really lucky to have the partnerships that we do with Nikki's team and with SADV and with Victim Services and with Family and Children's Services. I mean, without these community partnerships that we have, we wouldn't be able to even break through on any of this.
So thank you very much for helping to sort of clarify what human trafficking is and what that it really is in this community, and it's quite invisible, I guess, is the other thing you're saying. But I was also struck by something you said, Nikki, and it really brings us to this mixed theme we have of technology. How you talked about the sort of obsessive using of cell phones. So can we now talk a little bit about how you're seeing the internet and internet communication, cell phones, et cetera, how that is being used by perpetrators to enable them in trafficking, and how is it also affecting the victims? I know everyone's going to want to jump in on this, so do you want to start, Nick?
Sure. So there's been a huge increase, the role technology plays in luring people, grooming people, exploiting people, and trafficking people sexually. Perpetrators' tactics are evolving in how they gather info, how they make contact, how they communicate with folks. We've got traffickers using chat rooms, Snapchat, GPS software. We have people being groomed and lured over open world games such as Fortnite. Traffickers are finding ways that allows children to be advertised as adults quite easily, made very available online. And they exploit a false sense of trust in virtual spaces. So we have a lot of people using the internet who feel like they're talking to someone, to a friend, to someone they can trust, and that's being exploited. And it just keeps growing with the more accessible the internet becomes to everyone, the more accessible trafficking and selling sex and getting involved in exploitation is happening. I try to use like a pornography example. People used to have to go out to the corner store to buy a porno video. They would go to the store, they would be out in public, they would be seen, they'd have to purchase it. Then it moved to people being able to purchase this in their own homes, very privately done. Then that became even more accessible, and now you can purchase it in your home and not be traced. Then it became free. People don't need to purchase this anymore. So the demand grew, the need grew, and there was much more demand for cheap labor in the sex trade world. And buying sex and trafficking folks has been the exact same. It used to be you had to go out to purchase someone. Now you can do all of this online. And the impact that is having on our survivors is huge. They're being exploited, they're feeling scared, they're feeling threatened. Once a video or an image is out there, it continues to circulate. There is no coming down. You can take it down and it'll pop up somewhere else. And as she's trying to heal, this keeps being circulated, so she's being re-traumatized and re-victimized over and over again every time that video is shared. It causes major stress and complex trauma, right? People come out of this with depression, isolation, PTSD, borderline sense of overwhelmed, fear. Matt can talk much more about that piece.
Well, I know from our end, from a law enforcement end, technology allows people to be virtually anonymous, and if they want to be, they can be. There's ways of, you can get apps that will allow you to put in a fake email address once, and now you've got a phone number that's not attached to anything but an application, and now you can communicate through that app. And that's what we find a lot of the traffickers are using to post advertisements online. The communication can be done from the purchaser the same way with an online anonymity that, it's a stumbling block for us. It's not impossible for us to overcome, and we're lucky that we have partners like Magnet because they help us dig up these virtual identities, right? They help us figure out who these people are, and there's any number of technology companies out there that can do these sorts of things, but we've been really, really lucky. We've actually been able to help test out some of the products that Magnet's been putting out, and they're fantastic for doing these sorts of things and helping our investigations. On top of that, the technology piece is it's tough for us. We have to write judicial authorizations. We have to write search warrants and production orders in order to obtain certain information, obviously, and reasonable expectation of privacy is paramount, and we understand that. And it's paramount for everyone. And if we want to have a successful prosecution, it starts at the ground level with us making sure that things are done lawfully. So these judicial authorizations that we have to write, we can write them to these technology companies, and we're lucky sometimes that even American companies will kind of comply with our search warrants and our production orders, even though technically they don't have to. When it comes down to the seriousness and the heinousness of these crimes, they will generally comply. It's along the lines of, human trafficking and child pornography and all these sorts of offenses. There's enough public outrage that these companies, I think, would be silly not to comply. So they do, but there are times where, unfortunately, the information that we get back comes back to fake identities. They come back to fake email addresses. They come back to fake phone numbers. So it's a huge stumbling block for us. And again, we do have ways to get around those. We do have ways to investigate further that I'm obviously not going to get into because we don't want to put that out there for them to get smarter again. But we are very lucky to have technology partnerships like we do, especially locally. And that kind of expands into, I think, some of the things that Neil has.
So, it's quite frustrating when you hear in your own community. I know, and I've had these conversations with people in my social circles, they don't really believe that this is happening in our communities. And as I kind of step back in from our vantage point from the technology sector, looking at it, technology has been the main enabler that's enabled this growth. The anonymity piece is quite important to that growth, but I would say there's a few other things. The whole business cycle that Matt's mentioning and Nikki's talking about from marketing, I'm going to use the crass business terms, from the marketing of a human being to the sale, to the currency that's being used, technology's giving people complete anonymity and allowing them to operate in private space. And the trend lines, unfortunately, both from a technology perspective and a governance perspective, are actually being stacked against our law enforcement agencies. If we look, and I see him in the crowd, so I'll talk about where our origins are. So our founder, Jad Saliba's here. He's from with Waterloo Regional Police. And about 10 years ago, he was working on a case where a child was lured out over social media. And a lot of the techniques, I'm sure, were very similar to what was described here. And Jad, as a problem solver, thought to himself, he's got a victim's device, maybe he can get some critical evidence off of that device. And he worked and he wrote some software and he was able to recover that in a manner that would hold up in court. And that's a great solution, and everyone's probably looking at me saying, we've solved that problem, why are we not using it in human trafficking cases? It's a nice solution to that one social media application, but I would equate every new social media that comes on the market, and there's millions of them on the App Store, as a new community that Matt's team has to police every day. But they don't look like the communities we all drive through every day. They're deeply complex, have their own architecture, have their own corners where people can hide and commit crimes. All the while, there is no representative from policing able to patrol, to deter crime, or to investigate once crime happens. And these applications are evolving every day. Some of the larger ones are evolving every week so that what Matt could get 2 weeks ago, he can't get today. And that's where we see folks who are unscrupulous. And human traffickers are not new to the world. They've been around a long time, well before the digital age, but they're now thriving in this chaos of digital because they're moving from channel to channel. And that, I just talk about the architecture, some of the bigger trends in computing, in digital, things like moving to cloud-based computing. Today, I can send a message to my friends here on the stage, and it might not ultimately sit on the local device. So if it's critical to Matt's investigation, he can't get it anymore. It might sit on a cloud server in Ireland, and he has to go through a very long process. Yeah. But the common human trafficker, as Nikki mentions, moving up and down the 401 to avoid any single police agency. We were just talking at dinner that you can go on the 401 in one day and cross 10, 12 agencies, and they might be investigating the same person, but they're really chasing a ghost based on what the technology allows for. So that's the reality. I'm still hopeful in this space. I think there's solutions to this. Companies like ours are trying to work with them, but I think there's also going to be credible companies, I would say, in the e-commerce space or in social media that will think about, is anonymity really the tool that we want to give everyone? I think about kids, under the age of 12 having complete anonymity and others being able to access them. Is that really what we want in our society? So I think these are the types of questions when we get to the governance discussion we should talk about. Mm-hmm.
And Mike, you're in the financial sector, and how do you see human trafficking evidence in your work, and how is technology impacting?
So technology, from the perspective of the trafficker, it's a massive enabler because it grows their market. All of a sudden, like you made the point that you used to have to walk to the video store to take out a video. You used to have to take the person you were trying to exploit somewhere and then collect money for that service. Now you have a global community. You are trading people with communities all over the place. And when we're following the transaction, the money trail, it's not just money staying within one community. It's crossing all over the country and it's going internationally. So it's actually allowed what was you mentioned that this is something that's been around for a very long time before the digital era, you're right, but this has made it so much larger and made it so much profitable and grown it into a $100 billion industry that people are profiting from.
And I guess things like Bitcoin are another feature of it.
Correct, that's right, which furthers the anonymity.
Yeah.
So now you've moved into cryptocurrencies, and while we have a blockchain and we can kind of follow that, it's almost impossible to tie it back, that digital wallet, back to a physical person again. So we've gone the one step further, because you're right, if you're using your normal bank account, at the end of the day, we can always follow the funds. So even while you might be using a fake email address or whatever, at some point you're going to collect money from that, but virtual currency takes that away as well and adds to the anonymity.
I think we also be cognizant there's thousands of cryptocurrencies, and our friends in policing, will get tools eventually, but it always has a lag. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to note that the criminal in this case has these tools at free or at a very low cost. When our friends in policing want to evolve and modernize, they have to go back to the taxpayer, to their city councilors in a municipal context and ask for more money. Mm-hmm. It's a lot slower than a criminal going to a social media channel or a cryptocurrency. So I think we have to understand those broader societal dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and we think about this. If we were going to start a new venture, we're going to have a long-term plan. We're going to have a marketing strategy, all these things. They find a new technology, something they can use. They hit it as hard as they can, as fast as they can, maximize the profit, and then it's on to something else. It's just you leave that alone and you just cycle over to something else.
Mm-hmm. And that goes along with a lot of the victimization that we see. We used to liken these people to like drug dealers, where a drug dealer, when they have a product, they sell their product, they're out of their product, they have to find more product. Human traffickers, that's not the case. Their victims to them are renewable. And it sounds horrible to say, but they apply them with anything, any sort of fear, any sort of drug, anything to keep them working, to making them money, and that's where this all falls right back onto this victimization piece.
I'd make a controversial statement here. I think they have a complicit partner in some of the platform technologies who are creating these technologies and social engineering the algorithms to perpetuate things like anxiety among youth. We know what the common ones are. I think Nikki explains it much better than I can. And I'm not saying that they are legally complicit in this, but they are complicit in what's enabling the growth. It's an engineering activity. How many leads can I put out there to get a certain amount of anxious young people This is not I'm just going to play one person and see how this works. I think it's a much broader exercise.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And FOMO is considered real. There's a lot of new studies coming out of Harvard University right now, so FOMO's fear of missing out, that youth are really struggling with fear of missing out. And with constant streams of tweets, likes, comments, shares, this is actually affecting the reward area of our brains, and it's triggering the same chemical reactions that are triggered when we use drugs like cocaine. So it can be compared to just an injection of dopamine into the brain. So whenever this happens, when we get a like or a tweet or a share and we're on our social medias, the same areas of its dopamine is released over and over again, and it lights up the same areas of our brain that lights up when we use drugs. The brain is rewarded with minimal effort, and it actually rewires for easy dopamine release. Dopamines are happy chemicals, right? And it becomes an addiction. So not only do we have traffickers using social media to get at folks and lure folks and groom them and exploit them, but we have people who aren't able to necessarily keep themselves safe or put their phones down or not be on social media when things are going downhill because it's become like an addiction to them. And those are newer studies, but we are seeing it more and more in our program where we are trying to put safety in place. We're trying to talk about location settings, turning off your settings, shutting down certain social media sites because your safety has been compromised, and a lot of people aren't able to do it. They just keep re-engaging, resetting up, going for those likes, going for those shares, and that goes back to neurons in our brain.
It's incredible what you're saying, because it also means that this phenomenon is different from what it would have been 30 years ago, right? I mean, there presumably was some sort of human trafficking, but it was on a different, it would operate differently because you don't have this technological enablers. So we know that technology is part of the problem here, but you guys are also trying to work with technology as part of the solution. So can we talk a little bit about that? How do you use technology to get ahead of these problems? Does anyone want to lead off on some ideas about this? I know, Neil, your company is working in this.
And what we do is we develop digital forensics tools that police agencies use to recover and analyze and report on digital evidence. So if there's a suspect or a victim, our software is largely used to help in that investigation. And I would say that's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole solution. I would say on the technological solution side, we have to understand, the phenomenon and have more expectations on the larger platform technologies. If someone mentioned earlier, and I think it was Matt, but we don't actually know the full magnitude of the issue. That's on the victimization side, I think he was referring to it. I don't even think we have a full understanding on the attempts to victimize. And I think you don't understand what problem you're solving until you know what problem you're solving. When we don't know the magnitude of the attempts, we really don't know how to resource. I mean, Matt made the point, I don't think he was asking for more resources, but I'm going to ask on his behalf, you have a problem here. And public sector needs to be aware of it. But you can't start to solve a problem when you don't know what the magnitude is. So I think having some expectations on the large platform technologies, which have got away with, frankly, not doing their fair share, in my opinion, in society, to at least be able to flag how many times people are being attempted to be lured, especially victims under 18. At least that, I think, most reasonable people can agree that there should be a societal expectation for these large companies that are at the top of our major stock indexes to at least flag things like that, or where children are being commodified in marketplaces, things like that. Like, I think there's some basic expectations we can have, and there's technological ways for them to do this, which isn't a huge cost burden. It will require an investment, though.
Yeah. And I can say that technology, while it helps our investigations, the result of what that technology gives us also has to be able to be used by us in a way that allows for successful prosecutions as well, right? We have to be able to see this right through start to finish. And that's the nice thing, again, like having a background in law enforcement in a major tech company, it has that basic understanding, right? So we have to go into a courtroom now with a young person who's had the most heinous things done to them. We have to lay that out to people who may not have a great understanding of that. They are not allowed to know anything about it beforehand. It's our job to lay all of that out in a comprehensive form that is understandable, that's legal, that's lawful, that has made sure that there's no charter violations whatsoever, and it still has to show the trauma that's been inflicted. And unfortunately, that's not always the case, right? We're not always able to do that. Having a platform like we do now where it gives us something that's presentable and people can actually understand it and see it, that's the only way that we're ever going to win this battle when it comes to the legal side, is we need to have successful prosecutions to put enough fear into the people that are doing this to make them stop. That's the only way that we're going to win this war, and we're going to have to win that together, and that's why it's working, I think, this way.
Correct. And that's where really following the financial audit trail comes in as well, because that's something that's readily used as evidence. So in Canada, we have FINTRAC, which is the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center. Sorry, I always get that one wrong. But that's a partnership between private and public, so the banks working with our regulator, which is FINTRAC, to work together and share information about money laundering. That's what it started out as. But specifically, they've launched Project Protect, which focuses on human trafficking. So that is banks working together to say, okay, what does it look like from a financial perspective when this activity is occurring? So what are the red flags? What are the things that we can watch for in our transaction? It comes down to things like payments for escort ads, or it's frequent hotel and motel bookings, it's travel, flights, rail, buses, it's frequent deposits or withdrawals after hours, typically at ATMs, so this will happen after 10 p.m., before 6 a.m. If people are making large cash deposits by ATM in those times, it's not for legal activity. But all of those, we have a lot of data. There's millions of transactions flowing through the bank, and you asked how technology helps. We can now employ things like artificial intelligence or like machine learning to train the model, to train the machine to detect these patterns of transactions and reduce the amount of noise in that, so that our financial intelligence unit, that we have a team that just spends their days looking through this stuff, can make sense of that, can come up with actionable intelligence where we have real grounds to suspect that human trafficking is occurring. Then when we report that back to our regulator, that's when it feeds directly into law enforcement agencies, the RCMP, so that this can make it to a court. We can use this evidence.
Yeah.
So is the financial trail, I mean, it is all about money, right?
It is all about money.
At the end of the day. Is the financial trail kind of the most useful piece of evidence in these cases, or?
It's one of, absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's about kind of putting it all together into one big case, and they're very large, they're very time-consuming cases, and realistically, at the end of the day, what matters is the safety and health of the victim, and that, I mean, it's not always easy to keep that kind of, I guess, in sight, but we have one case that's just going before the courts next week, and it's been going since August of 2017. It's not easy to have a case drag that long and try and make sure that, like, the main focus through all of it has been the victim, but then also trying to pull all of these other pieces of that puzzle together to make sure that this case goes well before the courts, to get that satisfaction that this person is going to, pay for what they've done, essentially, in a court of law.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to consider traffickers, so technology is updating and moving so quickly. Traffickers have access to 21st century technology, whereas police force are working with 20th century technology and can't update and train their staff quick enough to keep up with all the new tactics, and then we're dealing with 19th century law. So we're kind of lagging a little bit, and we're not able to keep up to actually be effective in some of the investigations and some of our work with survivors.
Neil, the company that you work with, can you tell us a little bit more about how it tries to bridge that kind of century gap?
I mean, the laws are the laws, and they do evolve, but not as fast as technology. So, I mean, we spend time with folks like human trafficking investigators and other crime areas, child exploitation and other, to understand what they're seeing in the field. But digital forensics by its nature is reactive. Something's happened and we have to respond. And you know, we've continued to evolve. You know, as more data ends up in the cloud, we've had to consider cloud forensics tools. But our laws did not conceive of the idea that someone could do something in Waterloo, and all of the critical evidence would be in a jurisdiction, you know, thousands of kilometers away. And if you layer on where technology is going, layer on blockchain technology, what if it doesn't sit in one actual jurisdiction? Who's the jurisdiction? You know, Matt serves his court-ordered, you know, his powerful court order to, if there's no actual place where the critical evidence sits. So as much as this is going to be a technology challenge worth solving, it's going to be a governance challenge. I think we also have to have a dual-track narrative here because we can't solve it just through technology. We'll continue, and there'll be other great companies that continue to look at these challenges on a day-to-day basis. But these technologies are transforming laws that actually made our society work for a long time. Like the basic rule of law that, you know, if a court issues an order, I can't keep a cop out of my house if there's a court order. But in a digital context, we've actually allowed that. We've created this narrative that and I haven't seen recent Apple ads, but they're now touting their encryption as a great tool, as a great marketable tool. And that's like the whole ad is about their encryption. That's great, but if you're a victim of a crime and that's keeping you from justice, I don't think you love that encryption.
And if you think for a second that these traffickers aren't keying in on that and using this for that exact reason, 100% they are.
The one thing I'll add here is there's an aspirational piece to all of us. There's opportunity for innovation. As fast as we've seen big tech emerge, right? In less than a generation, you've seen the world's largest companies go from commodities-based companies to these platform companies, the technology companies. They can easily be displaced. And I think this idea that this is the new reality is a false piece. I think we're going to get to some more semblance of normal, that identity isn't a bad thing and that unlimited privacy is actually not a value for functioning societies. We don't have it in an analog sense, so we shouldn't have it in a digital sense. Companies that are thinking about these challenges, how you introduce identity management, especially for vulnerable populations, I think they're going to do really well. We've seen it in the banking sector. Really great innovation in Canada. There's two world-leading companies in identity just in Toronto, 2Keys and SecureKey, that is how you log into your bank securely. You care about privacy, but you also care about your money being safe. Well, we can extend some of those principles, and the great thing about software is the cost of creating these softwares is high on the front end, but the cost of replicating them and finding new applications for them goes down over time. So I think there's a lot of space for innovation. This is not a story that has to end with just accepting more human trafficking, but there also has to be an expectation from society that we're not going to accept, you know, these platforms and these digital currencies to only be used for or to be enabling such heinous crimes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, you know, when you started talking about this jurisdiction issue, FINTRAC and, you know, this idea of financial reporting and is actually it's part of a very international process,
yeah,
right? What FAF or something that was called, anyway, financial.
Yeah, all plugged in through Interpol, and you're right, they are all working together.
And you know, it was to deal with things like you said, money laundering, so organized crime and terrorism. And so human trafficking is like kind of benefiting in a sense, the enforcement against human trafficking is benefiting from a system that was already created. But it doesn't seem like the system in general criminal law has really internationalized like that. I mean, yes, there's Interpol, right? It sometimes works, but you still have to have your search warrant. I mean, don't you have to, you report some things internationally through FINTRAC?
Through FINTRAC. So FINTRAC has a Canadian mandate. I mean, they work internationally with all the other agencies.
Yeah.
So if I'm submitting a report that has something to do that spans outside of Canada, yes, they will reach out to their counterpart agency.
Yeah.
And then all that information flows through and becomes available to them. So yes, there is an international component to combating on that sense, but I think it's a lot more than I would like it to be. I think just the logistics of sharing data like that becomes so difficult, and the privacy rules. I mean, we can share. It's a big deal that we can now share some of this just between banks in Canada. That wasn't possible very long ago before the rise of money laundering in 2000 when it became a focus. That was the first time the banks really started sharing this kind of information. Before that, it was viewed as, this is our proprietary data, and nobody's gonna, we won't let it out. But I think at an international level that we're not there yet.
Interesting. Okay, so I have one more question before we open it up to the audience. So if you're thinking of questions, try and make them short and just ask one question, and that way we can hear from many different people. So the last question I want to ask you at this point anyway was about some of these policy ramifications. And Neil, you're a policy wonk, I can tell. I hear you wandering into policy frequently. So what are the, how is this battle going to play out, this technology battle between the bad guys, the exploitation of children, addicted to technology and being, blackmailed into these horrible situations, and the efforts of law enforcement and the technology companies that want to work with law enforcement and the banking sector? How do you think this is going to play out, and how do we deal with the, these complex issues like privacy and, privacy, I guess, is being one of the big ones, right?
I can speak to one. Early last year, the main platform that we saw for the advertisement of sexual services was Backpages, or Backpage.com. And it was taken down by the Department of Justice and several other agencies down in the States based on sexual exploitation and child sex offenses and some tax evasion and things like that. And it was great as a reactive thing to see that the federal government in the States was actually reacting to a much larger problem, and they recognized this much larger problem. But what they didn't realize was it was fairly short-sighted, because there wasn't a whole lot of other platforms that us in law enforcement would use. And it was a way of us, maybe not, we weren't centering anyone out, but there may be people out there that we know that are being trafficked that we just can't build a case on. Maybe they haven't come forward, maybe the evidence just isn't there. But it was a way of us in law enforcement. We could check ads once in a while, see the person was still there, we know that they're still around, we know where they are. It's a good way to kind of keep tabs, know that they're still alive, which is also a big thing. We know this is a very high-risk environment. So when they took the website down, we lost that ability. And we lost that ability, and it was a short period of time, and then a new one popped up, and it became popular. But during that time, I know for me, I was almost nervous. It was weird, because I'd come in and I'd kind of have my routine in the mornings, and I would kind of check up on certain individuals, and I didn't have that ability anymore. And so it was very odd to me, because I was concerned. I was concerned about the people that are out there. I'm concerned about the people that are being trafficked out there. And so it was a short-sighted thing in one end for me. And again, it was great that they dealt with it in the way that they did, but I didn't know how to combat that, right? I really didn't know where to go from there.
And we felt the same, because one of the easiest ways to start a financial trail was you'd see these payments for Backpages ads. So you'd see it on people's credit cards or off of people's debit, and then that would be that red flag that would start an investigation. Now we're starting to look for other things, but it gave us that entry point. And when it went away, to your point, there was a while there before the replacement popped up.
It was
where,
eerie.
Sorry?
It was almost eerie.
It was, because you just know, now what are we going to look at? And it became really, really difficult.
Yeah.
So it's one of those unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And then we also talk about something like Backpages coming down. There was some great news about what that meant to some of the victims as well.
Absolutely.
Because maybe not of human trafficking as much, but of the sex trades, that was like a vetting tool. They were using that to kind of know who was a safe client. And there was a lot of unintended consequences of what sounds like a good policy decision to combat human trafficking.
And we need to be very careful that we're not labeling sex workers as victims, because there is a huge difference between sex work and sex trafficking, and it's actually dangerous to conflate the two. It is legal in Canada to sell sex. That is a thing. Maybe people don't always know that, but it is legal. And we do have people in our community, adults, who consensually enter into agreements. They are making a choice to sell sex. That has always happened. When Backpage went down, it took away a huge platform for sex workers to work safely. They had their payments arranged. They had a way of vetting folks. And they weren't just left. Once it was taken down, not only did law enforcement have a hard time finding where now people were being advertised for trafficking purposes, but sex workers had to sort of try and figure out now how they were going to advertise, how they were going to run their businesses essentially, and it left them quite unsafe. And that happens a lot when we're talking about putting tech in place to combat trafficking, to figure out who survivors are, to try and rescue them. But we are taking away rights from sex workers when we do that. So it's a much bigger conversation about how can we use technology and be updated and prevent this terrible thing that's growing really quickly as trafficking and still protect our sex workers.
So maybe I'll just add, the best part about going last is I get to get all of these and then I get to add my own. So I agree with all that. I look at the policy frame in a very simplistic way. There's a risk-reward nexus, and we need to break it. The risk is so low and the reward is relatively high, and that's really, I think, what's driving the growth. And I think on the short-term side, and this may be controversial to say, but I just find the penalties in our country so low for those we can successfully prosecute. I know mandatory minimum sentencing is a controversial subject to some, but when you say the actual what the mandatory minimum was for human trafficking, that's now been challenged by an activist judge, 5 years, 7 years. Is this really, in other jurisdictions, 20 years, 25 years? A consecutive sentencing, so you can end up at like 100 years. So I would say that's one place to start. But I think about the broader context on the technology landscape as well. And I mentioned that there's an opportunity for innovation. I think policy can actually drive innovation, that we have zero expectation on the technology industry to have basic, and I'm not talking about over-regulation, but basic safety standards. Fundamental, 5 key fields that would be fundamental to a law enforcement investigation. There is no such standard in technology. So I think by standardizing on that, we will actually create an incentive for people to innovate in this space if they're not burdensome, if they're very simple. I'm thinking like 5 key fields. What the message was, the amount of money, the date, and the time. Like a starting point for every investigation. Because today, that might sound very simple, but that can be a 6 to 8 month process. And all the while, that trafficker might have been up and down the 401 how many times?
Yeah, I agree.
Interesting. I think you're almost laying the groundwork for, one of those, maybe down the road, a class action against some of these tech companies for having, negligent product that has endangered people.
Well, we're so early in the digital age. I think it's important to,
Yeah.
I still want to see if and I'll say that when people use big tech generally, not all behave the same. I think, I'll speak in the positive. Microsoft as a company does not like their platform being used for criminal enterprise. The challenge is their biggest business line right now is cloud computing. And a lot of the data that would have sat locally on a computer that would have been easily investigated by someone in a human trafficking division or in another division like fraud or any sort of crime. We've created this now, a new complex investigation was created that could take months, if not years. But they didn't put their head in the sand. They actually worked with the Department of Justice on thoughtful legislation that would protect privacy. It's called the Cloud Act in the United States. And they signed an agreement with the UK government, because that's where a lot of the cloud servers for consumer use are, to actually enable law enforcement to get streamlined data for investigations and protect the privacy of all the other users. So that to me is they knew what the problem they were solving and they went out and solved it. And it wasn't just writing ones and zeros in code. It was actually working with lawmakers to come up with what I think is going to be good law. It's still early days.
And it'll just have to be streamlined at the end of the day, because we can't afford 6, 7, 8 months for a judicial authorization to go international in order to get those results back in order to find that victim.
Okay, well, I think you've heard some very interesting information and ideas from these 4 wonderful people involved in different aspects of human trafficking and trying to fight it. So do you have questions? Would you like to pose some questions? I see one question over there, and somebody's got they're going to throw something at you. Hopefully you'll catch it. Please state your name and then your quick question.
Hi, sure. My name is Kusha. So my question is, I'm a little bit behind on the policy research. Has the legalization of sex work in Canada actually had any impact on the number of trafficking cases, or has that been completely negligible?
Okay.
Can he?
Should we take a few questions you want, or are there any other questions right now? Hi.
I appreciate all the proactive work you're trying very hard to do, and the reactive work that you're doing with such kindness for the victims. It seems to me we need to get to the victims ahead of time, so going into schools, teaching internet safety. I'm a retired teacher. We started that in grade 4. It's great that they have it coming into the curriculum in 7 and 8, but I do feel it needs to start sooner. As soon as you're on the internet, you have to be safe. So how effective do you feel, Nikki or Matt, getting into the schools? Is that going to be at all effective?
Okay, thanks. We'll maybe take one other question right now. I've got one down here.
Yeah, so my name's Joel. Just had a question around using the data. So you mentioned that financial data or data from devices, et cetera, is really important for an investigation. Thinking about being a tech community here, if I'm a consumer technology company, how can I make sure that you guys get the data that you want? So basically your recommendation on how I should instrument my app in a way that is going to help prevent this and be compliant. I know locally there's a bunch of companies that don't have a good track record, but they've tried hard, and so just interested in your perspective on that. If that's going to be a public forum like an RCMP API to report IP addresses for sexual exploitation, or if it's going to be a private endeavor, how you would recommend that.
Great. I think that's enough questions for now. We'll work on them. So the first one was about the legalization of sex work. Does it have any impact on this? Something like that. Did you get the question? So that's probably Nikki or Matt?
You want to start on that?
I'm trying to sort out what the question. Does the legalization of sex work have an impact on trafficking? Yes, it does, because we do have victims and survivors who are over the age of 18, which sometimes can be conflated as sex work. In court, because it's legal, the defense will often use, well, you're a sex worker, as a defense to have coercion dismissed, basically. So it does have an impact.
Yeah, the human trafficking portion, they'll go for a section, it's called a Section 276 application, which means that their prior sexual history can be entered into evidence. And generally, they'll try and streamline those applications to a certain time period when it comes to the prosecution on the Crown side, if that's what the defense is bringing. But they do try and use prior sexual history and the fact that, yes, I mean, it's legal, you can go and you can do that. They will try and enter that as almost like a character evidence type of thing. So I can see that, yeah.
And sex work can happen on a continuum, so you have choice, circumstance, and coercion, and you move along that continuum, and you might be a choice, but then somewhere within your career you meet someone and you end up moving towards coercion, and it's a little bit fluid, which is also really tricky within the sex work population.
It's kind of like a catch-22, isn't it? Because I was thinking that maybe it's easier with sex work not being illegal in Canada. It's easier to encourage people to come forward on human trafficking. But you just explained why it isn't, because the prosecution is so horrendous for the victim. And because I was thinking in the US that, one of the problems of coming forward is that you might get charged.
One correction that needs to be made, though, selling sex is legal. Buying sex is illegal. That is how our criminal code has it laid out. Our criminal code also has 3 parts in there that make it really difficult to sell sex. So we're saying it's legal, but we're saying you can't operate a body house, which is, could be your car, could be a motel room, anywhere you're providing sexual services, that you can't advertise. And then that buying is illegal. So Canada has said, yeah, you can sell sex, but we've made it almost impossible, which has made our sex workers really unsafe. So they can't come forward because then they're outing their clients. It's messy. We're a bit messy here.
Another policy issue. Okay. So that was a sex worker question. Then there was a question about early schooling, and I think I was going to start with you, Nikki.
Schooling. So was the question 7 and 8 isn't early enough?
Yeah, I think so. Because of technology, because people are using stuff so early.
So again, we're in a, when you're talking about curriculum getting into actual school boards, you have to follow Ontario provincial curriculum outlines. And according to our current curriculum, which we know has been under review and there's been changes and it's been a little bit complicated, it does state in the new one, grades 7 and 8, that there is talks of exploitation, that we can now have these conversations with these folks. Some of the pushbacks with younger age is that the adults in the children's lives feel like this might be a bit of a heavy topic to have with people who are much younger. We did play with that a little bit through Chelsea's story, and I know some folks are here who were involved with Chelsea's story, which was a play that we had over at Registry Theatre, but we also took it into a school, and we had young grade 4, 5, 6 involved, 7, 8, just 7, 8, no one younger? Okay. Those kids understood everything we were saying. They answered every question perfectly. And average age in Waterloo Region for entry into sex trade is 13 and 14. So we're catching them right at that time. Do I think we could go younger? Yes. Can we at this point? Not yet. Boy, that was a lot of...
Unless anyone else wants to talk about the schooling one, why don't we turn to the other one about the data, how to develop an app. Do you want to talk about that one?
There's an interesting link between, I think, those two questions. And if you're creating a consumer-based application that's targeting children, I think education and reporting can be a feature that actually is a differentiator. I think we passively, as an adult society, take for granted that when someone sends me a phishing email, oh, it's just another phishing email, put it in my junk folder. But that's actually an attempt at a crime. Now you take it in the human trafficking context, that's an even more egregious crime, if you ask me, because it's not just trying to get my money, it's trying to get something that's a lot more sacred to society. So I think this actually can be a differentiator for companies that in the future want to target, especially children, but also other vulnerable populations. And I think we're going to actually see that evolution happen. The other piece, my comment isn't that everyone should go run out in tech and become a digital vigilante and go chase people on the internet and try and do something about that. But the question is, what happens when you know your platform is being used to perpetrate crimes against children? And that's, I know who you're referring to in our community, that's where you're going to be judged. And I think when you get those opportunities, when you're building a technology and you're starting a company, you're just trying to stay alive. And I think everyone is respectful of that. But if you're successful and you have the ability to grow and you're getting more users, but you know they're being put at risk and you have the resources to do something about it, that to me is when you have to look to people who have expertise on the law enforcement side, whether that's locally or nationally. And I'll tell you, they're the types of folks who want to talk to companies because they want to get into the prevention side of this equation. They can't arrest their way out of these problems.
And being reactive isn't working. There needs to be a proactivity to this. And that proactive side with a company that comes to us to say, this is going on and we need to be responsible with it. What can we do? What can you do? Let's work together. Goes so much farther. And again, we still keep in mind reasonable expectation of privacy and everything that goes along with it. But absolutely, we need to work together in those.
So to Joel's question about what can you do when you're starting up an app, I mean, it's great that we can build in a way that you can tell somebody when you see it happening, but is it also, you mentioned one of the issues is how easy it is to be anonymous in these apps.
Absolutely.
And is that something you can do? Can you make it not as easy to be completely anonymous when you're setting up these services, especially if it's going to enable things like payments or messaging or anything like that?
Yeah, and I think the anonymity is what the perpetrators will look for every time. And if you can limit that right off the hop,
they're going to go to another platform.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'll also throw, and frankly, this is going to sound like a plug, but we've offered to law enforcement and to kind of platform-ish or consumer-based technology companies to reconcile that privacy piece versus the public good, the public safety one, and build kind of solutions to recover. So I mean, I think we have to get better at partnership. To me, something like human trafficking is not going to be a competitive edge. I think banks understand that.
Yep.
I think technology companies, frankly, should accept that there is if we standardize some basic things that law enforcement needs in their investigations, we could actually reduce the costs, the reporting costs for a lot of tech companies, and improve public safety. So I think becoming a little less competitive on features when it comes to the safety of users, especially when we're talking about adolescents. To me, that's not a competitive issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So we have time for a few more questions. So I see one in the back.
And here.
Okay, there's one behind too. So, okay. See the guy up there?
Oh.
Okay, we probably have three. You go ahead with your question.
Kind of on that note, I know that a tool for governing financial platforms in terms of anti-money laundering is verification of identity. What kind of tools do you expect in the governance of the digital age, perhaps like a verification of identity, do you expect might start to trickle through?
Okay. Do you want to take a?
We'll get three. And so there was somebody in the little further.
Hi. So I have a question for Matt regarding prosecuting people who have trafficked individuals. And something that Nikki said was that we have a 19th century criminal code. Do you find that the criminal code currently prevents you from having successful cases, or does it prevent you from being able to do that? Because I've heard that in Canada, it's more difficult to prosecute someone who's trafficked an individual than in other countries.
Okay, thank you. And is there a question down here somewhere? One more? Okay, there's one. Okay, she's bringing a red thing.
I'll pass it.
Right here.
Here, in the front row.
Sego, Sevegego, Jagansa Sena Gangans, Guyana Lagona, Nunwe de Ganagele. My English name is Heather Dawn Gingrich, and I am a United Nations recognized expert in mother-child and reproductive health and environmental factors. Usually air quality and food, but this is an environmental issue. So I've been in, this is block 2 of the 1784 Haldeman Treaty territory, but there's lots of treaties that go on here. So this has been a great discussion for me. It's been a long time coming. So I work with all of law enforcement. I do a lot of work in court. I come from a governance perspective, which just downriver, an hour, you will find like an amazing amount of like treaty scholars and people, including Six Nations tribal police. And I'm trying to get those law enforcement agencies working together, reconciliation on the same page. One of the things, so the good news is I work in the 401 trafficking corridor. It's very busy. It's one of the busiest trafficking corridors on the planet at the moment. But with all the technology, we're still not winning, and I think it's because we're missing the governance piece. So go back to the treaties. So I don't think this is something that we're going to win with tech. I think it's something we're going to win with relationship and communication. So, and this is something that's been very difficult. I don't believe any one of you are members in good standing of the Law Society of Ontario.
I am.
Oh, wonderful. So we can talk about that. So Justice Senator Murray Sinclair, who's the author of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, is also now currently a member in good standing. So I defer you to him because he's also a senator. One of the things that I've noticed is I have been arrested by Waterloo Regional Police 3 times in the last year, simply attempting to invite people for coffee so that we can talk about our joint concerns, because most of the community of Six Nations, and as well as other nations whose territory we share here, they're off-res. So they're here, they're trying to access services, justice, health, education. They're not able to for a variety of reasons. There's some beautiful footage from Waterloo North on the 23rd of September showing how you cannot access services or file a missing persons report if you're speaking anything other than English, including French. So this is problematic. So I am also concerned about title issues. And so have you looked at the TerraView software, which is an electronic title search and transfer? Now the transfer part, you have to be a lawyer in order to do it. Unless it's a restoration, you just want to give it back to the traditional, like the indigenous title holders, that's fine too. You can just do that yourself. But where is looking at the TerraView software, which is used to do these title transfers pretty much universally now? How is that being looked at to make sure that you don't have deceased lawyers or disbarred lawyers or any kind of lawyers doing these hundreds, thousands of dollars title transfers, because most human trafficking starts with insecure housing issues and people being evicted and people.
I'm just going to ask you, can I summarize your question? Because we don't have much time.
Yeah.
So you want people to talk a little bit more about the impact, say, on Indigenous people?
I'm really concerned about, because here, like Block 2 is probably the most high-value real estate. It's really high-value real estate. We have Google, we have BlackBerry, we have all of this tech development, but we don't have any acknowledgement of who the lawful title holders are, and these are legally defined agreements that have not been upheld by, the Crown's people, not the Indigenous side. So what are we doing about that?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Very interesting question. And I just have a feeling it's not entirely fair to these people, because they're not going to be able to probably answer those questions about title. But
I'll take one piece of it.
I will ask them what they can talk about related to the Indigenous people here. So why don't can we just start with that?
I can summarize better. It's like the data that we have indicates that Block 2 of this region, so Waterloo region, is both a hotspot for victims and predators. Mm-hmm. So how can we use technology and governance and Crown Indigenous relations, or a better relationship with our Indigenous neighbors, and the history that we have? And if you want to start somewhere, how about residential schools? Because the mush hole is an hour away.
I'm going to ask you to stop. Thank you very much for the question. And maybe Nikki, I know we talked a little bit over dinner about, you were saying that actually Indigenous girls have particular risk in this area. Is that right?
All across Canada
Yeah.
are very high risk of being involved in trafficking, and that's due to colonization, intergenerational trauma, sexual assaults that have been ongoing on reserves and within that population. Absolutely very, very high risk. And I like that you brought up the importance of a relationship. Mm-hmm. I think community-based centers do a really good job at trying to have the relationship with people that we're working with, and part of that relationship is making sure that we wrap around people and connecting them with the necessary. I am not an Indigenous person, so when I'm working with an Indigenous survivor, I need to make sure that I'm connecting with other Indigenous services like Six Nations. FNCS has an Indigenous team now. We're doing better. There's a far long way to go, and we can talk a long, long time about how we could be and need to be doing better, but there are a lot of improvements, and it really just comes down to that survivor and what they need and who they are.
Mm-hmm. I'll just take 1% of that, and I think it's really, really important. I'm not, I shouldn't be speaking about the rest of it, but the one piece that law enforcement or this community has technology, I think, is false. The reality is, I think there's a CSI effect going around that he can get a touch board and he can tell what Neil's doing, 2 hours ago in his social media activity. And the reality is, up until recently, he might not have even had the internet available to him at work. He was probably using his personal smartphone last year for work purposes, would be my guess. And that might not be the case for all agencies. So I think we do have to have a reset on what our understanding is of the abilities of police today. I think a lot of people have been influenced by movies and by things that aren't true, but the reality is the criminal right now has a lot of technology available to them at free or no cost. And we're not investing in our police. Frankly, we've seen a flat line in budgets in the Western world, and a lot of that's tied to crime statistics. And the crime statistics aren't keeping up. We haven't evolved how we collect crime statistics in the digital age. Like, we're not counting individual attempts at human trafficking as a crime. So if we don't know what problem we have, we're not going to invest in Matt's team. He said he went from 1 to 2, and that sounds like huge growth. But does that actually align with the growth of the crime? It's 100% growth.
100%. Yeah.
But does that actually align to the growth we're seeing in the number of attempts in Waterloo region on vulnerable populations being lured into what we're talking about today? There's no kind of simpatico between those two issues because we don't know the magnitude of the issue. So I would be very cautious in saying police, and this is not just a Waterloo context, this is, if you see the technologies that police are using today, the ability to collaborate across jurisdictions is all manual. It's all pick up the phone, call Matt.
And
did you want to say?
sorry,
Go ahead.
I can just tie that back into the other question about
Yeah.
the criminal code and the 19th century and stuff. So we can look at the CSI effect, like you said, enhance. Well, the other side of that is for us, we've had a lot of restrictions put on us, and rightfully so. But when you're looking at trials, there was a decision a few years back called Jordan. The Jordan decision has had a huge effect on us, has had a huge impact on us, because that decision basically says that there can't be any delay when it comes to trial. So a normal Ontario Court of Justice trial has to happen for us within 18 months. If it's going to Superior Court, it has to happen within 30 months. There can't be any undue delays. If there's any inexplicable delays, or there's any delays that have happened on behalf of the Crown, which falls on us as the police, those charges can be stayed automatically. Unless there's a good explanation as to why that case didn't get to court in time, those charges get stayed. And so that is a huge, huge influence on what we do. But what I've seen is the mandatory minimums, everything was being forced to go to court because no one wanted to go to jail for 5 years. So that meant that everything was going in. Everything was going to court, which meant then now we're under the 18 or 30-month crunch. And if we're not getting the information back from our judicial authorizations for 6, 7, 8 months, now we have to get that information. We have to now turn it into a form that we're able to understand. And I mean, I'm very much at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to the intelligence on this panel. But that's how we have to now turn it into something that we can understand and then put that out into a form that we can now say to the courts, this is what we know, this is how we know it. So going back, like the criminal code is older. The offenses have been updated somewhat. Case law and precedent definitely has had an impact on us, and to be able to put the best product forward with a very limited amount of time has put a lot of pressure on us. And again, we always have to keep in mind the well-being of the victim at the end of the day. So these are very complex investigations that they take their toll, for sure.
Was human trafficking not put in the criminal code until 2005?
Yeah, 2005.
That's pretty late in the game. And when it was put in the criminal code, Canada didn't know enough about human trafficking, and it's worded very as if all cases were international. I don't control criminal code, but it definitely needs an update so that we also cover the vast majority of what we're seeing, which is domestic cases.
There was a question in there too about knowing your customer. Mike, did you want
Yeah,
to
I can
comment
talk a little bit about that. Sure. So, someone did ask about identity proofing and how we ensure in a digital age that we know who we're dealing with. Banks in Canada do this better than anywhere else in the world, actually. So we are very fortunate. And there are some leading companies right here in this community, like you mentioned, that are doing this. So, and Canadian banks have a very low risk appetite. So we will always make sure with an abundance of caution that we know exactly who we're dealing with. So when it comes to the money being transacted within Canadian bank accounts, I think we're good. We know exactly who it is, and if we end up in an investigation, we can absolutely follow the funds within bank accounts within Canada, even as it crosses across financial institutions. Not a problem there. Where it gets tricky is when it's not going through a bank. So when we're talking about money service businesses, when we're talking about international money movement, but even domestically, if you're wiring, not wiring, but using a person-to-person payment app, and this is becoming very popular, that is not verifying who you are. So all of a sudden, we can see the money leave a customer's account, but then it's gone. We can't see where the catch is on the other side, and it might be to another account for that same person. but they can use these tools to disguise the trail of their money. So that's where we need to focus on the technology and do a better job. So great, we know who the customer is, but we also have to be able to say who the customer is sending and receiving money from before that's effective in building a case.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you for your great questions, everybody. Now, I have one last question for these folks, just to wrap this up. So, in less than a minute each, what would you like to say to the audience? Sort of your parting word. What is your ask? What is or the one thought you really want to leave with people here? Who would like to start?
I will start. I always like to leave people on a positive note. Like, this is a very daunting topic. It's very overwhelming, and it seems like we're getting nowhere. But we are doing better. Canada and Ontario, we are improving our efforts to combating human trafficking. Yes, we're a bit far behind in the law and things like that, but we are collaborating better as a system. Jurisdictions are talking more to each other. Services within regions are communicating better. We're switching shifts. We are focusing more on the survivor and what they need. It is looking good for us. All political parties are really interested in this topic. They all want to invest in it. They all want to see it stop. Everyone wants to support survivors. Everyone wants to update technology. It is coming. It is improving. And I just want you guys to leave here knowing that things are getting better. And
we're not going to give up.
We're not going to give up. Nope.
And actually, I'll build on that point on how it's getting better, because I talked a bit before about Project Protect and how FINTRAC is bringing all the reporting entities together to find and combat human trafficking. So I'm a stats guy as a banker. So this only started in 2016, and they've only released stats up until 2017, so only a year into, or 2 years into operation. They received 4,200 reports tagged with Project Protect. So this is reporting entities saying we have grounds to suspect human trafficking is occurring, which is a huge number 2 years into the operation. But those reports turned into 270 disclosures that FINTRAC made to enforcement agencies relating to 534 different subjects. So that's a lot of disclosures for FINTRAC to be taking this Project Protect data and going back out to agencies. But my favorite part of that is that 90% of them were proactive, so they weren't a result of production orders. So this is cases that very well might not have been on an agency's radar. Mm-hmm. So we are finding kind of net new intelligence about cases that might not be being worked at all and making sure that we're shining light onto that. So I do think we're making progress.
Yeah, maybe I'll go. I'll start 20,000 feet and just say, don't accept the status quo. It's not as, I think we look at some of these technologies we've talked about tonight and just assume they're going to maintain what they are today and never evolve, and they're evolving actually every day. So you can influence that as a consumer, as a citizen. Once you have knowledge of an issue, it's what you do with that knowledge. So I would say expect better for the friends here who are from the technology sector. Be aspirational in this. These are not markets that are social media or cryptocurrency or how we store data. These are not things that have been decided for the rest of history. I think there's a lot of room for innovation in these spaces, so make this aspirational in its outlook. I know it's a really tough subject, but I think things like the safety of vulnerable populations, to me, is something worth pursuing as a business. I think about our origins as a company, and it was really just solving a really, really bad issue that was going on at work and was common around the world. And our founders here could have just accepted the status quo, but wanted to actually be part of the solution. So I encourage you at some level, whether that's frankly just criticizing the social platforms you're on, or if you're in development, using your scarce talent for something good. That'd be my message.
Yeah. And if none of that makes any sense to you because you are not techie, but you care about human trafficking, then support the agencies within the community who are doing this work, because it is important work. Funding is never guaranteed, and we need support from folks like you.
Matt?
I think for me, just seeing the ages of some of the people that we deal with, I ask that any of the parents, any of the caregivers, anyone with kids, know their friends, know their social circles, know the platforms they're using. Always be aware of what they're doing, because too often we end up having to be reactive with them. Too often we lose sight of what they might be doing or who they might be communicating with. And the last thing that we ever want to have to deal with is someone going missing and someone being trafficked. So at the end of the day, for me at least, you need to have communicative, I was working on that before I came out, relationships with your kids. Make sure they're not afraid to come to you with tough questions and give them the real answers. Be real with them, be open with them, and make sure that they understand that you're there to support them and love them and care for them, because if you don't have that relationship with them and we end up having to be in a reactive situation, I've seen firsthand the toll that it can take on families. So just try and foster those relationships with them.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to thank you for joining us today. I think this is a very positive step to, just participate in this kind of a conversation and learn more about it and realize, this is an issue within our community and we all can play a role in it. And I guess what's really interesting about this panel is you do see people from different backgrounds who are working together across these professions to make a difference. So thank you all for joining, and please join me in giving them a really big hand.